Okay, welcome to our lecture material on family policy. So this is really going to just barely scratch the surface of family policy because family policy can be a semester-long class. In undergraduate and graduate programs, you can get an entire graduate degree on social policy. And so it'll be also pretty elementary, mainly because policy hasn't been an area of expertise for me and has always been a little bit hard to understand. But I've tried to make things more concrete in this lecture. So if you're like me and have struggled with family policy, hopefully you'll come away with a stronger, kind of more specific understanding. So obviously, policies are all around us, and this is just about policy in general. And so where policies come from is first our government, and that's called public policy because the public can influence the policy most of the time. So that's laws at the federal, state, county, city level. And it's also court rulings like Supreme Court rulings and also lower court rulings. And then other sources of policy that aren't laws are from organizations, which is called organizational policy. And this is various regulations, requirements, and rules, right? So this is a business has a policy on what you can return. School has maybe a private school has a policy, a dress code policy. Certainly we are seeing lots of public and private policies now around COVID. So that just kind of gives us a sense of where policy comes from and what it is in general. So in terms of family policy, it's considered basically a subset of social policy. So social policy is basically societal structures, laws, and rules that basically address humans. Family policy is a subset of that. It's just supposed to be more specific to people with children or children. However, as we're reading in our readings, basically almost all social policy becomes family policy, even if it's indirect or implicit. So here's an example of a policy from public housing. So private policy associated with a nonprofit organization. And so you can see here a 17-year-old grandmother lived with her grandson in public housing. Her grandson was found to be dealing drugs, and so because of the policy in the public housing unit, she was notified that she was going to be evicted. Some lawyers basically helped her kind of refute that and keep her home on a technicality. And so housing policy is considered, for example, more social policy, but you can see that it quickly becomes family policy because it's affecting, this grandmother and her grandchild. So in other classes, we talk about Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory and kind of how various systems influence one another. And in our field, human development and family studies, a lot of us are training to intervene in the microsystem, right? Especially if you're becoming, a therapist or you're developing programs for families, the microsystem is really your area of expertise. Policy is more macro, or in the case of the Bronfenbrenner model, it might be exo or meso as depicted here. So this is one conceptualization of policy and ecological systems. And I would say that these systems here, exo, meso, they're defined a little bit differently than I often teach them. But the basic idea is that policy doesn't really take place in the microsystem, but it's influenced by the microsystem. But then it takes place in these kind of broader systems. And so I think what will happen is even if you're trained to work in the microsystem, let's say to be a counselor or a therapist or to deliver, different prevention or intervention programs, you will quickly find that your interventions can only go so far if a family is bumping up against a problematic policy. And this was the case for me when I was actively studying work and family and also a therapist helping people, navigate work and family, is that, quickly I could do a little bit to help them, for example, have equality in their divisions of labor or things like that. But, if their workplace wasn't very flexible, or they didn't have a lot of kind of paid time off, that was something that I didn't have a lot of control over, that was more in the realm of policy. You could also imagine, helping an immigrant family, for example. There's a lot you could do to try to be supportive, but so much of that, of their experiences are influenced and basically regulated by policy. Okay, so these are considered the key areas of family policy. And in the US, family policy really targets low-income families, since we have less universal social services, for people of all income levels as compared to some other developed countries. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this material is illustrate each of the content areas that we've studied in the course and how they each have corresponding family policies. So in the slides that follow, for each content area, I pick a sample policy that has either been recently enacted or it's still in effect, even though it's older, and has current ramifications for families. And so my goal is that this will help kind of operationalize policy, make it more concrete for you. Okay, so starting with race and racial discrimination. As we've learned in this class, people of color, particularly African American men, are incarcerated at disproportionate rates compared with white individuals. And the reasons for this are related to the war on drugs and the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, PRWORA, which was basically known as welfare reform or TANF reform. And so as part of that 1996 welfare reform, it included a lifetime ban of Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, also known as food stamps, to anybody who had been convicted of a drug offense at the felony level. So you had been released from prison, but basically you are never for the rest of your life eligible for SNAP or food stamps. And this ineligibility, some researchers have found, has been correlated with increased recidivism, so reoffending, maybe especially economic related crimes, and it of course then disproportionately affects people of color. Okay, so this is a recent landmark ruling by the Supreme Court that basically determined that the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited job discrimination based on sex, also covers sexual orientation or transgender status. So sex can transmit not just to gender, but sexual orientation and transgender status. And so this is the first federal legislation preventing the discrimination of people who identify as gay, lesbian, transgender, non-binary. So it's a pretty big deal. Okay, this is a recent tax cut or tax loss, I should say, in 2017. And like most tax cuts, it was designed to stimulate the economy and help hopefully low-income families. And so what it did was it reduced the marginal tax rate. For a lot of people, it increased the standard deduction, increased the child tax credit, it capped the amount of the state tax deduction, and it also removed the Affordable Care Act mandated tax penalty for people who did not have insurance. Research is suggesting that there is now, as a result of this, higher tax deductions for middle and upper income, more so than lower income families. So for example, you're more likely to receive the tax cut if you're middle and upper. Only about a quarter of filers in the lowest quartile are expected to receive the tax cut. So tax law obviously is complicated, and maybe even if you're intending for it to, I don't know how much it was intended to benefit low-income families, but perhaps even if it's intended to, it doesn't always do as intended. So regarding relationship formation and cohabitation, we've had, several decades of initiatives to encourage people to get married and stay married. And this initiative was passed in 2005, but I'm nearly positive that there were other bills to support healthy marriage prior to this one. But this one is still in effect, and it authorizes $150 million per year to support research and programs that promote marriage and father involvement. And you can check out more there on that link. As has come up in some of our readings, these programs have had mixed results, some success and some varying success, but the overall sense I get is that they haven't been as successful so far as was hoped. Okay, probably the biggest policy change in recent years affecting marriage was the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. So in terms of policies related to pathways to parenthood, here are a couple of them. One on contraception, one on adoption. So the Affordable Care Act, ACA of 2010, mandates that health insurance cover contraception at no cost, including LARCs, long-acting reversible contraceptives. And some states have basically additional laws that require healthcare providers to give people information about LARCs. In terms of adoption equality, this was a Supreme Court ruling that overturned a state ban on adoption by same-sex individuals or couples. And so it effectively legalized same-sex adoption in all 50 states. Yet it's important to know that state laws vary regarding what's allowed for second parent adoption. So you might have a biological parent who's gay or lesbian, but it might be more challenging to have the second parent who's married to that biological parent be a legal parent. There's different laws around private adoption agencies, so perhaps being able to get out of things for religious reasons, and also foster care placement. Okay, so in terms of family processes, and more specifically parent-child relations, home visitation programs targeting mothers, such as the Nurse-Family Partnership, have historically had pretty strong effectiveness and a solid evidence base for quite a number of years. So in 2010, as again a part of the Affordable Care Act, these two programs were established. So the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, and then its kind of accompanying program, which was my hope, which was about evaluation. So these were established by the ACA in 2010 and then reauthorized in 2018. And basically, these programs provide grants to communities for visitation programs and evaluation of these programs, and they specifically target at-risk communities. It's important to note here just the policy implications of having a home visitation program that focuses really only on mothers, not on fathers. Okay, so then thinking about policies related to divorce, remarriage, and stepfamilies, there's a lot of them. So just to highlight a couple, regarding kind of shared custody, this is varied by state, and some states historically have granted more joint custody, some states more sole custody. We have joint custody increasing, but again, that's kind of an example of how court rulings or judge decisions influence policy. And then in terms of tax law, the IRS only allows one parent to receive the dependent deduction for a child. And so if you have two parents with joint custody, that becomes challenging to decide who's going to get that deduction. We've been learning about multi-partner fertility in our readings, or MPF, and basically our laws in general, our policies and laws have been geared around single partner fertility, like you have 3 children with one other person, not you have a child with one person and then another child with another person and then another child with another person. And so research has found, for example, that when you're a non-custodial parent and you're paying child support, you're going to end up paying more if it's multi-partner fertility, if you have children by multiple partners versus single partner fertility. And I don't know that that's specifically due to a law. It's more just that you've got multiple court rulings regarding custodial payment or child support payments versus just one ruling, and it ends up being inequitable. But it's still something that could be rectified by policy. Okay, there's lots and lots of work family policies, and we talked about some of those last week, even when we talked about flexibility, and of course even that paid leave act that we talked about in this lecture can be associated with work family policy too. But here's a couple. That 1996 law that reformed welfare also set up the Child Care and Development Fund, CCDF, that was reauthorized by the Child Care and Development Block Grant in 2014. And this basically gave states money to subsidize child care and also to evaluate their child care programs and conduct research. So here in Colorado, we have the Colorado Child Care Assistance Program, where low-income families can obtain basically subsidies to reduce the cost of their child care. It was, for example, programs like Early Head Start. It was set up so that families would really have the choice of provider and could choose more center-based care or an in-home provider like a relative, but recent kind of laws with the reauthorization kind of have more strict rules around training and certifications, and so it's been harder for families to have in-home providers, and perhaps maybe even more money's going to centers rather than to families. And so if you're a family with a non-standard schedule and a center-based care doesn't work for you, then we've got some challenges and maybe some need for some policy revisions. Okay, lots of laws around families and health. And so this is the one I mentioned that could fall under work and family as well. This Colorado Proposition 118 around paid medical and family leave that just passed. So as a nation, we have no federal paid sick or family leave, even though many developed countries do. We have something called FMLA, which you may have heard of, the Family and Medical Leave Act. It guarantees 12 weeks of unpaid leave and lets you keep your job. It doesn't apply to the very small businesses. It's got some specifications on how big the business has to be to warrant FMLA. So because there's no guaranteed paid family and medical leave, like obviously CSU has that, but lots of companies, there's no requirement that companies have to have this. So states have been passing initiatives like this over the last several years, and this is Colorado's, that with a payroll tax, there is now up to 12 weeks of paid medical and family leave for people working in companies that are kind of mid-sized, basically, because the big companies already had this. The small companies still don't qualify because it would be too much of a burden if you're, a mom and pop business of 3 people to pay someone for 12 weeks if they're not working. But for those kind of mid-range companies, now there's a mechanism for people having paid leave. Okay, so intimate partner violence, that lecture material has some laws in it as well, kind of talking about what constitutes domestic violence. But I've always thought that this was an interesting one here in Colorado. Colorado is a mandatory arrest state for domestic violence, which means that when police officers are called to a home, when they're responding to a domestic violence call, they are mandated to make an arrest if there's probable cause that domestic violence has occurred. And the probable cause, there's 5 areas. Probable cause that there was intimidation, coercion, control, punishment, or revenge. And it's to any degree, so it doesn't have to be super severe. And then police officers are required to make an arrest. So the goal of this was to prevent basically minimizing domestic violence, or that kind of on-site recanting by the victim, or pressure on the victim to recant. But and it has really helped that, but then it also has resulted in maybe automatic arrests on questionable grounds, and automatic arrests of a lot of not just men but women as well. Okay, so when we think about families in later life, a current issue right now is grandparents raising grandchildren, something that has been rising in our society a lot of times due to kind of drug use, for example, and incarceration of parents, and so for drug-related crimes. And so federal law in 2018 led to basically an establishment of this council, the Federal Advisory Council to Support Grandparents Raising Grandchildren, that was basically going to evaluate kind of policies and resources and kind of come up with plans to improve the resources and the dissemination of resources. And if you're interested in this, you can follow the link there to get more information. Okay, lastly, immigrant families. So we'll touch on this in the immigrant families lecture along with other policies, but basically undocumented immigrants in the United States don't qualify for social welfare programs such as food stamps, SSI, TANF, or welfare, or Medicaid. Basically, the only thing that they qualify is emergency medical care under Medicaid. So then you can imagine the policy implications of that. If you can't qualify for other services, things are gonna get to be an emergency situation before you will maybe seek out help or services. And you do qualify for disaster services through FEMA.